I'm Ian Denise from Gradient. Hi. And today, this session, we're going to talk about the interesting trade-off between open source and closed source models and AI safety, along with a few interesting model releases from Meta AI. So this gentleman over here, Joe Spisak.
Gentleman.
From Meta AI, Director of Products. And Joe, I want to start with me doing an introduction of you.
Okay, sounds good.
So I'm super excited for this conversation because I actually met Joe about 3 years ago when I was a PM at Meta AI platform team building this thing called feature engineering. Seems like it's not really relevant anymore for Gen AI.
It was the belly of the beast. You were working on the hard stuff.
Exactly. And I remember, I don't know whether you still remember this, you were the person who did my PM onboarding meeting on my first day joining the company.
Yeah.
When I knew nothing. And you were the person who told me all the interesting Meta AI strategy in open source and responsible AI.
Yep.
And fun fact, that was way before ChatGPT was even a thing. So in a way, you're the first person to tell me just how ambitious Meta AI was for the open source model. And I feel there's one thing I didn't do. I should have bought more Meta stock. Right after that meeting, when he showed me so much insights, when the stock price was only $100.
Oh, yeah.
So huge regrets. But joke aside, fast forward to today, Meta has already become the driving force for a lot of the open source AI movements from things like Llama, PyTorch, along with Llama Stack, which are the developer toolchain, which Joe is leading. And on top of that, Joe, you're also involved into a lot of open research projects from FAIR. That later became very interesting startups.
Startups, actually, yeah.
Right? Mistral AI, Evolutionary Scale AI, and many more. And on top of that, this gentleman, he also did a lot of involvement in the nonprofits organization like PyTorch Foundation, AI Alliance, which is an industry effort for promoting responsible AI and open science. And you're co-leading the trust and safety working group there as well. And last but not least, before Meta, you were also leading different AI initiatives at different big tech companies, including Google and Amazon and Intel. And on top of that, you're also the advisors and angel investors for many startups. Very busy schedule.
Here.
Some of them are actually here, right? Like last mile. And I guess very interestingly, you're having this amazing background between understanding the founder empathy, you have the empathy for the founders, and on top of that, you know the platform and enterprise insights really well. So perfect speaker for today's founder audience.
Thank you for the kind intro.
Yeah, so want to kick us off with just a quick intro about what you're working on recently?
Yeah, I feel like in my career, I've worked at a lot of the different layers of the stack. I mean, actually, my early part of my career is actually in the chip space, in semiconductor, and so my degree, my education is actually in electrical engineering. And so I think it's funny, if you're in the chip space, you spend a lot of your career, at least when I was in the chip space, you spend a lot of it fighting to get out of the chip space. You're like, I want to get into software. I want to get into the cool parts of what people are doing. And then AI kind of turned the chip space into something sexy again. Google's doing TPUs, there's Grok and there's Cerebras, and there's all this stuff. NVIDIA, the most valuable company in the world now. There's been a kind of this rejuvenation. So, but yeah, I started my career on the designing chips and doing engineering and product, and then it kind of went after about a decade or so of that, moving into machine learning, kind of more by happenstance than anything. And then I've worked, on building large language models with Llama, and leading the product for our open source efforts. Obviously, PyTorch, Sumit Chintala, he's around here somewhere. He's going to do another fireside chat later on today. Working at the framework level, all the way through to actually doing research. And actually, we had an org that we built, myself and a few other folks, around math and science. And we've been really lucky in those teams, the protein folding team went off to create evolutionary scale AI. Believe it or not, the team that built Mistral, or is Mistral, was our team that was actually doing AI in mathematics and trying to basically leverage LLMs and tree search and reasoning, essentially, or inference time to basically solve, things like IMO problems or aspirationally Riemann hypothesis, right? Eventually. So I've kind of seen everything from a lot of different levels, which has kind of given me a unique perspective, I would say.
That makes sense. And speaking of Llama, 2 months ago, I believe, Llama 4 has a few new variants like Scout and Maverick as the new releases. So I remember there's 17 billion parameters model, and they have a really long context window between 1 million all the way up to 10 million tokens.
That's right. Yep.
So really curious your take, like what are the new capabilities or applications do these large context window open source model unlock for the developers?
So, I mean, for me, like so going back to like, when I rejoined Meta, like almost like a little over 2 years ago now, can't believe it's been that long. I was asked to basically lead our open source effort around Llama and build the ecosystem and build models that people really, really loved. And I think from my perspective, like I've actually been really excited at the startup ecosystems that was kind of born out of open weights. I know there was like discussion earlier this morning at open source open weights. But not only Llama, but obviously like some of the other models like Llama from Google and Qwen and DeepSeek. Like there's actually this incredibly vibrant ecosystem around these, and it's actually allowed a lot of startups and a lot of others to kind of bootstrap, off of the investments from big tech companies. So Llama 2 was, I would say, was kind of like the start of the revolution in some ways.
Yeah.
And then Llama 3, I think I'm really proud of the models that we shipped. We shipped multimodal models that supported image. We shipped probably like the largest by parameter count kind of open frontier model in the 405B. That was, I don't know how many conversations with Mark to convince him that we want to release, something that probably cost us close to $1 billion to make. And then of course, we started releasing smaller models. And then, Llama 4. I think Llama 4 was our first kind of foray officially into like MOE models. So we went and built mixture of experts models, which are, if you're not familiar with mixture of experts, so each expert is, say like a certain number of parameters, and you only have like certain parameters that are active at inference time. And so in this case, 17 billion are active. These are also the first models that we built that were natively multimodal. So if you remember in like the Llama 3.2 and at Connect, we launched those. You'd actually have adapter weights for say image or video type of modality. These are actually doing early fusion. So essentially everything is a token, right? Whether it's a text token, whether it's a patch of an image or video or audio, anything, it becomes kind of a token. And as a result, we've trained on tens of trillions of tokens, quite a bit more data. I think the original Llama 3 training was on 15 trillion tokens. I can't remember how many were in Llama 2, something like 2 or 3 trillion, maybe 2 trillion tokens. So we've gone from like 2 to 15, and I think like the largest Llama 4 one was trained on something like 40 something trillion tokens. So quite a bit larger. What this has done really is unlocked, I would say, almost like a platform. Like I think we were somewhat happy, I think, with Llama 4, but I think the really interesting thing now is like you're going to see a lot of post-training happening on Llama 4 as a platform. And so you're going to start to see those models get better and better because like it's not like we have to pre-train again. We can actually do a lot of like post-training, reinforcement learning, a lot of things at inference time, and actually improve the models pretty significantly, even on those base models.
I see. And looking ahead, I'm pretty sure there gonna be more interesting model from Llama family.
That's
and
right.
We read about the news, right? There's another one, flagship model called Behemoth.
Behemoth,
That's gonna happen soon.
Yeah.
I heard. Yeah,
it's
tell us. Yeah, what can you share with us? I know it's quite kind of low key right now, quite hidden. What are the new capabilities there?
I mean, I think like so with these larger models, it's quite difficult, obviously, for anyone to deploy them, even for us. No matter how many engineers or like compute you have, like it's a 2 trillion parameter MOE, and so even having the amount of memory space or compute to be able to run it. So what those models end up being actually is a great kind of like knowledge distillation source. And so you can kind of like, we simplify it as like a teacher and a student, and we'll generate traces from, say, a really large model, and then we'll actually like do something like a knowledge or data distillation on a smaller parameter count size model. And what it does is actually allows you to take really like a lot of like the goodness that's in that really large model and actually kind of almost compress it down to something that's more usable. We've actually done that with some of the models that we've deployed on our phones. So we have a project called PyTorch, which is kind of an edge kind of mobile embedded framework for deploying kind of LLMs. We use it. So for example, like on our glasses, like we're actually deploying models on like literally locally on your glasses.
Wow.
And it keeps things private. It keeps things like low latency, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so what we can actually do is like leverage this really big model and actually compress it down into something that actually can deploy into these kind of like local environments.
Yeah.
And so really like that's one of the best ways for us to leverage a large model like that. Obviously, it allows us to kind of also experiment with evaluation and how much we kind of push the frontier on these kind of like emergent capabilities. So the more you can push scale, the more you can kind of uncover these things. And it's one of these things where it's evals and large models are kind of go hand in hand. You don't quite know what you're going to get. It's how you evaluate it ultimately is really what your capabilities end up being. So, but yeah, it's going to be great. It's going to be useful for us to build small models. Just allow us to push kind of scale a little bit more and learn more. So.
Cool. Looking forward to see more updates from Meta about Behemoth. Cool. I guess another kind of personal updates for you is you recently moved back to the PyTorch team.
That's right.
To lead the PyTorch team again, among the other things. So help us to understand the history of PyTorch and how does it play a role in the overall Gen AI innovation ecosystem? Yeah,
I guess who's heard of PyTorch, hopefully? Okay, thank God. Okay, I was actually at a conference. I was speaking in San Francisco like last month or two ago, and I asked who had used PyTorch to be great. It was like 3 hands and this like packed 1,000-room crowd.
I'm surprised to hear.
I was really surprised at that too, to be honest. So PyTorch has been interesting. I mean, it's I got involved probably 7 years ago. Now, maybe almost 8 years ago. I've known Sumit for over a decade, and PyTorch started out as kind of a research project in FAIR, small. It was essentially the evolution of the original LuaTorch project. And in 2018, very early 2018, I guess January 2018, I joined Facebook working with Sumit, and we were thinking about how do we evolve to research to production? How do we take this insane, at the time we thought was insane, maybe not as insane as today, but how do we take this insane community of research that's pushing the limits in computer vision and NLP and all these other areas, and how do we build products as quickly as possible? How do we leverage that inside Meta to build great products, basically? And so we decided to kind of converge and build this full end-to-end platform, and of course we named it PyTorch. And it's been pretty wild. I mean, in like the last 5 years, ChatGPT is built on PyTorch. OpenAI joined us. We were actually working closely with OpenAI. It's actually, ironically, the reason why I'm an angel investor in Anthropic is because a lot of those original like team members from OpenAI who went and built Anthropic, like I was, without knowing it, I was actually helping them build GPT-3.
Wow.
And lots of Friday night calls and nickels broken or whatever. And so OpenAI jumped in. Obviously, Meta was all in, and this community basically just exploded. And obviously, with Gen AI, like we use it, OpenAI uses it, Anthropic uses it, Stable Diffusion, all the things.
Yeah.
So it's become this kind of foundational ecosystem community around AI.
Yeah.
So, which is pretty exciting.
For sure, and we're gonna hear more about PyTorch later from the technical side later in the next 2 sessions, I believe. I want to switch gear to talk about something a little bit like the trade-off between closed source and open source model.
Yeah.
So again, we all know that as the LLMs become commoditized, and so the value really shifted, right? I think, Joe, from some of your past interviews, you also mentioned the value shifted away from model to things like fine-tuning, data, and also additional inference strategy. And for the early stage startups, the founders over here, obviously they don't have unlimited budgets. And obviously the timeline is really tight because the competition and also the pressure from the investors. So because of these, how should the early stage founders navigate the technical sequencing for closed source model or open source model? Do they always do, closed source model API to start with to just ship to the markets quickly? And at what points should they think about leveraging open source like Llama to really optimize the cost and have a little bit more control?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the morning, the gentleman, I think from Cake, was saying that open source is dominating. I actually disagree with that. I actually think closed is by far winning right now. I mean, how many of you are building on like closed source APIs from like OpenAI and like Anthropic and so lots of hands? How many are building on open source models right now? Okay, that's more nice. I mean, that's cool. Actually, I really think like, I mean, ultimately, models need to be hosted in some way, and like, it's actually a lot of work to host models. That's why, like, Sentinel, like GoDaddy is right over here. Like, that's what they do. They host models, and I honestly didn't realize how powerful like that is until I started actually talking to like some of these enterprises, because I'm a tech guy at a company that does social media, right? AI person, and so when I start to kind of like venture outside my bubble, I realize like how much of a bubble I do live in and operate in, and like having these platforms like Fireworks and Together and Sentinel actually are incredibly beneficial to like getting these models hosted and actually making them as easy to use as something like, you know, say GPT, you know, 4.0 or 0.3 or whatever.
Yeah.
I do think like closed source is like is an easy way to prototype, and it's like batteries are included. Like you can get started quickly. You can get credits. I do think like one of the things that I'm hoping, because I think the way I see this space evolving is like there's more and more teams that are starting to post-train models. And I think that's actually a good thing, because I think the value is like the last year and a half or so is shifted from, okay, I got to go like figure out how to pre-train a model. Well, shit, I can't raise $1 billion like Ilya Sutskever or, you know, or Thinking Machines. So what do I do? And what I've seen is actually like we're in a scenario now where we've gone from like pre-training being a huge value and obviously limited to Google and Meta and OpenAI and others, to now being in a situation where the teams with RL expertise and post-training expertise that are kind of like leaving those labs, right? They're kind of forming companies and they're building state-of-the-art coding agents like Reflection and Cursor and some of these folks. And like they have that capability because they've kind of like gotten it from building large models of these big companies. And what I think is going to happen is, and I'm hoping personally to be part of this revolution, is if we can build the tools such that we can democratize that ability. Because reinforcement learning is still, even for RL experts, is still very much a dark art. So if we can kind of democratize and make it, you know, easy for, frankly, any startup that really wants to you know, hire or squeeze an ML people to actually do post-training, like we can actually give you the tools to be able to do that. And that allows you to differentiate. That means you can use your data. That means you can, because ultimately, like with RL, it's all about what reward model and reward shaping that you actually, as a, you know, as an application, I would say that you're targeting. So in other words, like you might actually be in a better position to like shape the reward for your model and your system than like OpenAI's model, which, you know, is hoping to zero shot your application.
Yeah.
And the closer you are to the user, the harder it is to zero shot anything. So I think there's going to be another phase here where like the number of startups and the number of like users able to post-train and like do it at scale and do it in a way that is like unique to their application, I think it's going to explode.
And quick follow-up there, like what's the right moments should they think about doing this additional optimization? Is it based on revenue, based on the scale, based on the user counts?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, it does depend on like the complexion of your team, and like you have ML people. Like if I do think like you can get a prototype. Like if you start to get like a prototype with say a closed API and you kind of feel like you're kind of getting product market fit or you're onto something, it does become like kind of interesting to start controlling your own destiny. And again, I think there's a lot of hosting services that you don't want to go and, you know, spin up a Kubernetes cluster or do multi-cloud, like all that stuff. Like that is a lot of work.
It is, yeah.
It's crazy. What you want to do is focus on your users, focus on your application, focus on what the value is. And, you know, like I think, you know, Gennady said that earlier, like, you know, commoditization of like the infra stuff, absolutely happening. 100% agree with that. Commoditization of the application layer is not happening. That's where things are unique. You know your user the best. Because I've had like large startups come to me in the past who are very successful, and they said, well, what if GPT-5 like just is able to zero shot my entire application? I'm like, it's not going to happen. Like, come on, like bullshit.
Yeah.
So, you know, I really do think like this is an opportunity for when you start to get that sense of product market fit, like start getting folks that are like even SWEs, you know, like that they don't have to be ML experts. There's a lot out there these days in terms of tools and knowledge.
True.
That they can start really figuring out how to fine tune or even do like RL post training. I'm going to bet within a year, I think people are going to be doing a lot of RL everywhere.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. We see the trend for sure. A lot of reinforcement, fine-tuning, kind of managed service are available out there in the markets. Last kind of type of the questions I really want to learn from you is AI safety. So as I mentioned earlier, you're co-leading the Trust and Safety Working Group from AI Alliance. And what's your suggestion or best practices for startup founders in terms of like applying the right guardrail for their AI products when they're using open source models?
Yeah, this is pretty timely, this question. Actually, Sumit and I were having dinner last night with the chief scientist, AI scientist of a fairly large private company.
Yeah.
And some of the things he said about safety, we were chatting about safety. This is what we do over steaks, right? We talk safety, AI safety. But no, some of the things he said, just like I literally almost started to tear up. I was so proud of the work that, have folks even heard of something called Purple Llama?
Yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay, that's Vin. Okay, Purple Llama was a project that I started probably over a year and a half ago now, and the whole goal was really to create open safety tools, and the reason we called it purple was red team, blue team, really offensive, defensive capabilities. How do we build evaluations that allow us to understand, are we generating insecure code, for example? Which is a big problem, obviously, with coding agents.
Yeah.
But then, once I've realized we have a problem, or we can measure the problem, because the first thing is being able to measure it, is then how do I actually, in production, can I mitigate against it? And that's where the, guardrails and systems at scale are able to basically, they're not perfect, but they can protect and kind of mitigate these things. So we started this Purple Llama project. It was a bit of a, leadership really didn't care about it, right? It was why are we doing this? Well, with these systems, you want to be able to build, you want to be able to build safety outside of your core model because you want to be able to adapt it.
Yeah.
So for example, we fought internally about the taxonomy that we were, going to use, the harm taxonomy. Is it child sexual exploitation? Is it violence? Is it suicide? Is it, all these topics that no one wants to talk about? But what are those? What does that taxonomy look like? And so we had kind of a standard one that we ended up bringing into the ML Commons to standardize, and that's what they use for all their benchmarking and so on. But the real goal here was how do we give the tools and the platforms and the pieces, the models or evals to startups, the folks in this audience, to be able to then customize for what they need.
Yeah.
And that was the whole point of Purple Llama, was how do you actually, so you don't like the 10 category taxonomy there, maybe because it doesn't align with say the, the location or the geopolitical nature of your deployment. Maybe it's Europe, maybe it's Asia, maybe it's wherever. You can actually fine tune that, and you can actually modify that in a way that it matches kind of what your product goals are. And that allows you as a founder, as a team, actually the power to kind of build custom safety. Because what we view, say, as violence at Meta may not be what others perceive as violence, or these type of things. And so giving the tools basically for founders, for users, for companies, to kind of build safety into their systems and do it at scale based on the things that we had to build for our own self at Meta.
Yeah.
That was the whole goal. And I was so, when I heard how powerful that is firsthand, it was amazing. So.
Yeah. Do you guys use Purple Llama internally too? Because you're a model provider.
Absolutely.
How do you balance, the open waste versus mitigating the misuse?
Definitely. And things are very specific geographically, whether it's Meta is Facebook deployed in the Middle East versus Asia versus Europe versus wherever. We have custom models that will filter, or currently internal evaluations for different coding agents and so on. So we definitely use it. We just use different versions of it that are kind of custom for Facebook and Instagram and these other applications.
That makes a lot of sense. The last kind of set of the questions I have is, we talk a lot on startups adopting open source model.
Yeah.
And I believe there's also a lot of startups, actually, they are building open source themselves, right? For example, in the AI era, we have AnyScale that has Ray. We have Crew AI, LangChain. We have LLM Arena, which is one of the company you're advising. many more. And for Gradient's portfolio, we have quite a bit of open source companies as well, like Streamless got acquired by Snowflake, Mastra, Infinsical. So curious, like your thoughts on how do you see open source play a role in startups, no matter implementation perspective or building the company around open source?
It's not easy. I mean, first of all, I think it's like finding that line between like the open community and because the value of open source really is the community that you grow around it.
Yeah, the bottom up POG.
Right.
Yeah.
And then how do you build value that you can then monetize? And I think that's like really, really difficult. Like I think like we've seen kind of like Spark and some of these other projects where clouds will host a kind of a hosted version of it that's like managed, right? And so I think like that's one way to do it. Like Ray, for example, like Anyscale will provide essentially a more performant, hosted, managed like Ray, and then some, and other things around it, right? And that'll help monetize from there. It is difficult. I think, like to me though, I really like startups. Like one of the reasons Gennady and I get along so well is like we both contribute to a project called VLLM.
Oh, okay. Which is, what is that about?
So VLLM is a project out of UC Berkeley. It's really 2 students or PhD students that maintain it. Yeah. A gentleman named Simon and Wusuk. And but it's foundational for so many companies and how they deploy LLMs at large scale. In fact, Meta has actually adopted the project as well. And so how we actually deploy these in applications, how do we do it in a performant way, low latency, how do we do it at cluster scale, that kind of stuff. So I think like to me, I look at like I tend to gravitate definitely towards startups that are open, like have affinity to open source because in some ways like I can actually like see what they're doing and I can actually like interact with the engineers and if they're like too secretive, obviously like so I like that and I like I just like to understand like what they're doing in the community that they're building and like one of the projects that I at the very early stage I advised was the Lightning AI. So actually their founder was a FAIR intern. Okay. Actually out of NYU, out of here in New York, Will Falcon. And like I just saw like how much user empathy they had and how much they were working to build this community around this like this paradigm, this like training paradigm that they found for like large scale distributed training. And they've turned on and they have it as a core and then they built all this value on top of it. But their engineers are still like open source at heart. And that there's something about like open source engineers that like I don't know, like when we recruit people, I immediately go to their GitHub repo and see like, what they've done.
Check their projects,
Check what their commits are, like how they interact with other users. Like, I don't know, that's me though. But I think like, so I tend to gravitate towards those projects. But
that makes sense. Well, we only have 1 minute left, so I want to give you a few very quick questions, and you have to answer these questions very quickly as well. Okay,
sounds good.
First, what's your favorite open source AI projects outside of Meta right now?
Outside of Meta? Yeah. I mean, I think like, there's no secret, I'm a big fan of like local LLMs and like local agents. I think they're super cool. I like run Llama all the time. I run a project called Anything LLM, which is really cool if you like want to get people together to like do joint RAG. Like basically it's like runs locally, like you can basically hook your own data up to it. And it's completely private. So if you and I wanted to do like an Anything LLM together and we wanted to like pool data and keep it private, like run LLM, we could do that and do RAG basically. Yeah. So we could have our own like little agent.
I will check it out.
The Denise and Joe agent. Interesting. So those like, so yeah, I'm a big fan of those projects.
Nice. Another question is because you are advisors for many startups. So what are the mistakes you see a lot of AI startups made over and over again and you want them to avoid these mistakes in the future?
So I tend to, so my, a lot of the startups I get involved with tend to fall from the, like, they come from the research side. And so I think they just don't know what they don't know in a lot of ways. Like they don't have like really a CEO. They just kind of have somebody who was like working on research and all of a sudden I'm the CEO. Yeah. And so they don't know how much to raise. Like they also think about like almost like academic success as success of a startup. So hey, we published this paper and it was cited a bunch of times. Why the hell can't I build a startup?
Yeah.
And like that's a common refrain I've seen from like a lot of researchers. So they do need help. And this is why I'll invite them and get them to interact with like VCs. I think are really smart.
Yeah.
Raising too much money, obviously. I think that they're trying to, as we were talking about in the roundtable last hour, like there's a lot of them that want to kind of maintain the same compute lifestyle, right? That they're at a Meta or Google or OpenAI, and that's really hard. You got to raise a ton of money to do that.
Yeah, very different.
And it's very expensive, and it's a lot of like wasted. It's money just burning through GPUs and so on. So those are probably like the major things. But like hiring a good GSB, I think is like for a lot of the research ones, it's probably a good idea because like researchers just aren't good at running businesses. So
well, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for all the insights. That was my last question. We're a little over time, but thank you again. Thank you, Joe, for coming here. And